In those kind of legacy industries, when it comes to, the marketing of vendors, being the ones who are servicing these industries with technical solutions, what always struck me was that the marketing looked the same. Whether it was the content that I was consuming online, whether it was walking through a trade show hall and looking at the same booth over and over and over again with the same language printed on that booth, whether it was even the makeup of a marketing team within these vendors, that, it was a predominantly sales-driven organization with marketing taking on a very light supporting role. It always struck me as quite behind the times. B2B buyers are changing, and the way that they research and they buy products and services are changing. Yet there are thousands, tens of thousands of businesses out there who are failing to keep up with those times. I actually don't think it is an unfair assumption. I think that for a lot of industries and a lot of sectors, kind of boring marketing is very commonplace. I mean, there are exceptions, obviously, particularly in SaaS and specifically within MarTech and sales tech. You're seeing a lot of really interesting and innovative uses of content and media and branding to really differentiate businesses and kind of drive that awareness, which ultimately has an impact on the bottom line. But in the vast majority, I would say, of sectors out there, particularly legacy sectors like media, like energy and utilities, like manufacturing, the playbook is the same today as it was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Yet the buyers in those industries are changing. So I don't think it is actually an unfair assumption. I think it just requires a lot of people to almost reset their mindset on how do we go out there and develop an effective go-to-market strategy. I always knew I wanted to go out there and start my own business. And what I was waiting for was for the organization I worked at previously to sell. So the equity that I had would vest and I could kind of go and start my business with a nice soft crash mat in case it all went terribly. I didn't want to sit on my laurels. I wanted to go out there and start doing something so that when I did eventually venture out on my own, it would be as easy and as stress-free as possible. Ultimately, what it meant was that, fast forward to January of 2023, when we launched the business officially, we finished, employment on the Friday and then started client work on the Monday. We went into the first week with 3 clients already in the books and about 60 to 70,000 in pipeline. And that would not have happened if the podcast hadn't existed, if I hadn't been recording and publishing a weekly podcast for 2 years prior, building out my profile, building my brand awareness, showcasing my point of view, but also refining my point of view, I think, on what's broken about B2B marketing. The success we had in the early days just would not have been possible if we hadn't have gone through the process of running the podcast in the first place. So I say that, when it comes to launching a podcast, you should spend 30 to 40% of your time actually creating the content and the remaining 60 to 70% of your time distributing the content. And that weighting is intentionally in that way because one of the common mistakes that we see our clients make, or, companies that are launching podcasts, that are running podcasts themselves independently, is they spend a lot of time agonizing over the creation of the content itself, finding the right guests, asking the right questions, packaging it up so it looks really highly polished, creating a dozen or so episodes before any of them actually ever, get to air. And then they post it, they publish it, they post it once on social media, and then they move on to the next one. It just, podcasts by definition don't have any inherent discoverability. It is very hard to be found within a Spotify or an Apple Podcasts, directory, unless someone is looking for, almost the specific terms that you're including in your podcast description. So you need to, double, triple the amount of effort that you're going to put into promoting that podcast yourself than you would into other kind of content formats or other content mediums. So that's one of the most common mistakes that I see, is that you spend a lot of time creating, not enough time distributing. So I see there being kind of 5 components to launching an MVP podcast. The first is goal setting, having a really clear idea of what does success look like. And I strongly advise that keeping it as simple as possible is where you want to start. So one goal, one objective, one, thing we can look at to say, in 3-6 months time, this allowed us to achieve our objectives, or it didn't, and we can then make a decision based on that. Now, you may have milestones as well. So like we have leading indicators to tell us whether or not we're making progress towards those objectives, but determine what is your objective first and foremost. The second thing, premise. So messaging, is another way of looking at it. What is this show going to be about? There are a lot of podcasts out there, increasingly so. And in order to differentiate, you need a compelling premise. And that's made up of your what and your why. Your what is your topic. Like, what is it that we're going to be trying to uncover, that we're going to be discussing on our podcast? Our why is our hook. What is going to allow it to differentiate, to stand out from all the other podcasts out there that are also talking about, a similar topic to us. Next is your format. So format, yes, a podcast is an audio medium, but are you going to want to also include a video component to that? And why do you want to do that? Are you going to want to include a written component, like a newsletter, accompanying newsletter? We need to start mapping out, in terms of the actual content itself, what is that going to look like? How are we going to package that up? Again, starting with one thing and really nailing it is where I recommend people start, before then layering in other formats, because otherwise you can spread yourselves too thin too soon. The fourth is talent. So who's actually going to be the face of our show? And there are a lot of different kind of routes you can go down when it comes to who is the face, who is the on-air talent. It could be the founder or the CEO. That's where a lot of brands will naturally kind of default to. But there are pros and cons. Yes, they may be incredibly knowledgeable and have a lot of authority in this domain. But then again, maybe they aren't available as much as you would like them or need them to be in order to produce the content. Maybe it's the marketer. They have a really deep understanding of the audience, but as brand custodians, are they going to feel comfortable tackling some of those more risque subjects that are going to create great content, but, packaged in the wrong way could backfire a little bit. Could be a third party. There are a lot of podcasts out there that hire podcast hosts or content creators to host their content, but then that comes with certain expense. So there's no right or wrong answer, but really thinking through, who is going to be the on-air talent is incredibly important. And then the fifth pillar is about operations and logistics. So do we have the right talent internally, and not on-air talent, but, do we have the right skills internally to pull this off? Do we have content creators, distributors, subject matter experts, the approval layers? What does that all look like to do this consistently? And then do we have the right tech as well? In terms of podcasting, specifically, like I see a lot of potential for AI to help. We use it at B2B Better as an ideation tool. So, being a podcast agency, we work with a lot of different types of clients, exclusively in the services industries. But, we have companies that are data service providers, and we have companies that work in the energy sector, and we have companies that work in, mobile app design and development. We're not necessarily experts in all of those fields. So using something like ChatGPT in order to help us ideate, potential topics or themes for our clients' podcast that we can suggest to them, and then they can take away and refine. that's a really impactful utility of tools like ChatGPT and others. Whatever it is, nailing those marketing fundamentals is so important, and yet so many brands, fail to do it. They get wrapped up in kind of tactics and execution and hype, and then they're surprised when all of it kind of falls flat on its face, and they just blend into the background of everyone else doing the exact same thing. So when it comes to trends, like unless you've got that core positioning messaging piece in place first, I wouldn't worry about trends. Just focus on the fundamentals.